For 20 years, she was the undisputed sovereign of the high seas, a floating cathedral of steel that embodied the very essence of the British Empire. To the public, she was the Mighty Hood, a name whispered with reverence from the docks of Portsmouth to the outposts of the Far East. She was the largest, fastest, and most graceful warship in the world, a symbol of a maritime hegemony that many believed would never fade. Yet, beneath the polished brass and the meticulously scrubbed teak decks, the HMS Hood was a beautiful lie, a relic of a bygone era struggling to maintain its relevance in a world of increasingly lethal technology. The tragedy of the Hood did not begin in the cold waters of the Denmark Strait in May 1941, but rather in the smoke-filled design offices of 1916. She was a child of the Great War, born from the lessons of the Battle of Jutland, yet she failed to fully internalize the most painful of those lessons. The British Admiralty had long been obsessed with the concept of the battlecruiser, a vessel that sacrificed heavy armor for overwhelming speed and massive firepower. It was a philosophy championed by Admiral Jackie Fisher, who famously declared that speed was the best form of protection. But Jutland had proven Fisher wrong in the most horrific fashion imaginable. 3 British battlecruisers had vanished in cataclysmic explosions after being struck by German shells that easily bypassed their thin deck plating. The Hood was already under construction when these disasters occurred, and while her design was hastily modified to include more armor, the core of her structural identity remained compromised. She was a leviathan with a glass jaw, a ship designed to hunt but never truly built to take a punch from an equal adversary. As the interwar years rolled on, the Hood became a victim of her own fame. Because she was the pride of the fleet, the Admiralty could never find the time to take her out of service for the massive, multi-year reconstruction she so desperately needed. While other aging ships were stripped down and rebuilt with modern horizontal protection and improved machinery, the Hood was kept on the front lines of diplomacy. She toured the world, her elegant silhouette gracing postcards and newsreels, hiding the fact that her deck armor was dangerously thin against the plunging fire of modern long-range naval guns. By the time the clouds of the Second World War gathered over Europe, the Hood was an aging queen. Her engines were weary, her hull was overloaded with years of incremental additions, and she sat lower in the water than ever before. To the sailors who walked her decks, she was still a magnificent home, but to the naval architects who knew her secrets, she was a disaster waiting to happen. The emergence of Nazi Germany's new class of warships, specifically the Bismarck, turned this theoretical vulnerability into a looming existential threat. The Bismarck was the antithesis of the Hood. Where the Hood was a product of compromise and aging tradition, the Bismarck was a masterpiece of modern engineering and brutal efficiency. Displacing far more than the limits set by international treaties, the German battleship was designed for one purpose: to survive. Her armor was distributed in a way that made her nearly unsinkable by traditional gunfire, and her primary battery was controlled by the most advanced radar and optical ranging systems of the time. When she slipped out of the Baltic in May 1941, she was a wolf entering a sheepfold. The British response was a mixture of desperation and calculated risk. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, commanding the German task force, knew that if he could break out into the vastness of the Atlantic, he could strangle Britain's vital supply lines. The Royal Navy, stretched to its breaking point across the globe, had to stop him at all costs. The task fell to Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, flying his flag from the Hood, accompanied by the brand new but untested battleship Prince of Wales. It was a pairing of the old world and the new, both flawed in their own ways. The Prince of Wales was so new that she still had civilian contractors on board, frantically trying to fix the chronic mechanical failures in her main turrets. As the two ships raced toward the Denmark Strait to intercept the Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, the atmosphere was thick with a sense of impending destiny. Admiral Holland was a man of meticulous detail, yet he was haunted by the tactical limitations of his flagship. He knew that at long ranges, the Bismarck's shells would fall at a steep angle, striking the Hood's weakest point, her thin deck armor. To counter this, Holland's strategy was to close the distance as quickly as possible. By narrowing the gap, he hoped to force the engagement into a flat trajectory battle, where the Hood's heavy belt armor could protect her vital organs. It was a gamble against physics and the relentless accuracy of German gunnery. On the morning of May 24, 1941, the grey mists of the North Atlantic parted to reveal the silhouette of the German hunters. The two greatest naval powers on Earth were about to collide in a clash that would last only minutes but echo for decades. The tactical failures began almost immediately. Due to the angle of their approach, the British ships could only bring their forward turrets to bear, while the Germans were able to fire full broadsides. Furthermore, in the confusion of the opening moments, Holland mistakenly identified the Prinz Eugen as the Bismarck, ordering his ships to concentrate their fire on the leading vessel. Although the error was corrected within minutes, it gave the Bismarck precious time to find her range without the distraction of incoming heavy shells. The German gunners were legendary for their cold precision. On the Bismarck's bridge, Captain Ernst Lindemann waited for the perfect moment to unleash his ship's fury. When the order finally came, the Bismarck's 8 15-inch guns roared in unison. The first salvos were terrifyingly accurate, straddling the Hood and sending towering plumes of icy water into the air. On the Hood's boat deck, a fire broke out among the ready-use ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns, a flickering orange omen of the catastrophe to come. Inside the Hood spotting top, officers watched through binoculars as the Bismarck's fifth salvo arced through the sky. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight, the shells visible as tiny black dots against the grey clouds. One of those shells, weighing nearly a ton and travelling at twice the speed of sound, found its mark. It did not strike the armoured sides of the ship, it plunged through the thin upper decks near the mainmast, slicing deep into the bowels of the ship where the aftermagazines were located. What happened next was a moment of pure, unadulterated horror that defied the laws of naval combat. A pillar of flame, several hundred feet high, erupted from the centre of the ship. There was no massive, eardrum-shattering boom at first, only a terrifying, rushing sound like 1,000 blowtorches. The fire was followed by a colossal explosion that tore the Hood in half. The mighty Hood, the pride of an empire, was being dismantled from the inside out by its own ammunition. The ship's back was broken. The bow rose high out of the water, its forward turrets firing one last, defiant salvo into the void before the weight of the machinery dragged it down. The stern section, detached and mangled, capsized and vanished beneath the waves in seconds. From the moment the fatal shell struck to the moment the last piece of the Hood disappeared, less than 3 minutes had passed. Of the 1,418 men on board, only 3 would survive to tell the tale of the ship's final moments. The 3 survivors, Ted Briggs, Bob Tilburn, and Bill Dundas, found themselves floating in an oil-slicked, freezing void. They were the living witnesses to a systemic failure that had been 30 years in the making. They watched from their small rafts as the Prince of Wales, battered and suffering from multiple mechanical failures, turned away under a smoke screen. The Bismarck stood victorious, seemingly invincible, while the surface of the water was littered only with debris and the haunting absence of a legend. The loss of the Hood was a psychological blow to the British nation that is difficult to overstate. It was as if a piece of the national identity had been erased in a single heartbeat. The Admiralty's reaction was one of focused, cold-blooded fury. The order was sent out to every ship in the Atlantic, sink the Bismarck. The pursuit that followed would become one of the most famous naval hunts in history, but it was colored by the bitter realization that the era of the battlecruiser, and perhaps the battleship itself, was reaching a violent end. The systemic failures that led to the Hood's destruction were not just technical, but philosophical. The British Naval Command had relied on the prestige of the ship to act as a deterrent, failing to realize that a symbol is not a weapon. They had sent a ship from 1920 to fight a ship from 1940, ignoring the reality that technology had moved faster than their budget or their willingness to admit obsolescence. The Hood was a victim of a calcified hierarchy that valued the appearance of strength over the reality of survival. In the aftermath, the investigation into the sinking was shrouded in controversy. Many refused to believe that a single shell could have destroyed such a massive vessel so quickly. Some blamed the fire on the boat deck, others blamed the torpedo storage, but the truth remained the same: the ship's magazines were not sufficiently protected against the reality of modern war. The unsung heroes of the day were the men who stayed at their posts in the engine rooms and the magazines, knowing that the ship was dying beneath them, yet continuing to perform their duties until the very end. The destruction of the Hood marked the true end of the Victorian naval tradition. It was a brutal awakening for a navy that had long believed its own mythos of invincibility. When the Bismarck was finally cornered and sunk days later, there was little joy in the victory for the men of the Royal Navy. The price of the German ship and Appo's destruction had been the soul of the fleet. The tragedy served as a grim reminder that in the theater of total war, sentimentality and tradition are no match for the cold, hard logic of steel and high explosives. Today, the wreck of the HMS Hood lies in the darkness of the North Atlantic, 2.5 kilometers below the surface. She is a war grave, a silent monument to the 1,415 men who went down with her. The images of her shattered hull, captured by modern deep-sea expeditions, reveal the sheer violence of her end. The bow and stern lie far apart, separated by a debris field that tells a story of a ship that was literally blown apart from the center. The historical takeaway of the Hood is one of profound irony. The ship that was designed to be the fastest and most powerful of her age became a symbol of vulnerability. Her story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of resting on one and Appo's laurels and the catastrophic cost of failing to adapt to a changing world. The mighty Hood was a masterpiece of a world that no longer existed, a beautiful, tragic ghost that continues to haunt the annals of naval history. As we look back through the mist of time, we see the Hood not just as a ship, but as a warning. She reminds us that the grandest structures of human ambition are often held together by the thinnest of margins. She teaches us that pride, no matter how well armored, can be shattered by a single moment of reality. The legacy of the Hood is not found in her victories, for she had few in combat, but in the enduring lesson of her fall. The sea has a way of swallowing both the great and the small, leaving only the stories we tell to make sense of the carnage. The HMS Hood remains a towering figure in those stories, a ghost ship sailing through the collective memory of a nation. She was the last of her kind, a majestic relic of an empire that was itself beginning to fade into the twilight of history. In the silence of the deep, she rests, a reminder that even the mightiest can fall, and that the ocean never forgets the price of hubris. The story of the Hood is the story of the end of an era. It was the moment the big gun gave way to the aircraft carrier, the moment the battleship lost its crown. It was a transition written in fire and blood, a narrative of systemic failure and individual bravery that defines the human experience in war. As the waves of the Atlantic continue to roll over her final resting place, the legend of the mighty Hood remains as vast and as deep as the ocean itself. In the final accounting, the Hood was more than steel and steam, she was the hopes and fears of a generation. Her loss was a tragedy of design, a disaster of tactics, and a triumph of the indomitable human spirit in the face of certain death. We remember her not for how she died, but for what she represented, a bridge between two worlds, a titan caught in the gears of a changing century. The engines have stopped, the guns are silent, and the fires have long since been extinguished by the crushing pressure of the abyss. But the echo of the Hood's final salvo still rings out across the decades, a haunting melody of service, sacrifice, and the relentless march of time. She is the eternal sentinel of the Denmark Strait, a queen in exile, forever frozen in the moment of her greatest trial. History is a cruel narrator, often focusing on the wreckage rather than the journey. But for the HMS Hood, the journey was one of unparalleled grace and service. She carried the weight of an empire on her shoulders for 20 years, and if she buckled under that weight in the end, it was only because the world had become too heavy for any ship to bear. Her story is finished, but her lessons remain, etched in the rusted steel and the cold currents of the North Atlantic. Rest in peace, mighty Hood. The watch is over, the sea has claimed its prize, and the history books have closed on your final chapter. But as long as men go down to the sea in ships, your name will be spoken with the respect and the sorrow that only a true legend can command. The horizon is empty now, the smoke has cleared, and the ocean is once again a vast, indifferent blue. The saga of the HMS Hood is complete, a timeless testament to the glory and the tragedy of the human endeavor.
She was the pride of the Portsmouth Quay, the grandest cathedral to sail on the sea. With polished brass and the teak wood deck, She wore the sun like a gold-spun neck, but beneath the grace of her elegant stride, a fatal secret was locked deep inside. Built for speed, a hollow ghost, guarding the dream of a fading coast. The lessons of Jutland were cast to the gale, leaving a giant, fragile and frail. Oh, mighty Hood, the queen of the foam, the North Atlantic is now your home. A shell from the Bismarck, a pillar of light, tore through the silence of the morning mist bright, broken in two by the weight of her pride, the pride of the empire. Beneath the dark tide, the Bismarck waited, a wolf in the gray, while Holland gambled the light of the day, closing the distance to save her from fire. But the deck was a target, a funeral pyre. One single strike through the thin rusted plate sealed up the mission, decided the fate. The fire erupted, the magazines roared, 1,000 tons falling, the iron, the sword. Less than 3 minutes to fall to the deep, with 1,400 for the ocean to keep. Only 3 souls left to tell of the rain, of the oil on the water, the ghost of the pain. Now she rests in the dark, where the pressure holds fast, a relic of glory, a ghost of the past. No more the thunder, no more the parade, just the salt of the memory that never will fade. The watch is over, the ocean is wide, the queen of the seas lost to the tide.